Welcome to Conversations in a Vintage Shop, a podcast from behind my counter between customers. Join me while I sit behind my retail counter and just have a conversation with you, or with myself. While I look out the window, observe what I see, things that are happening in the store today, throughout the week, and just fun little stories that I have from my time as a business owner. This is something that you find interesting, then keep listening, and I appreciate you. Hey everyone, welcome back to Conversations in a Vintage Shop podcast, where I just have conversations with you during my shop hours and bring the conversations that I have with customers and friends and everything in between here at my shop. Now, last week, I took the week off, just kind of sort through some of the ideas I had for future episodes and also not to get too burned out. I've had a lot of events happening the past couple of weeks, and I needed just a week to breathe, which is nice. I'm getting better at doing that. But on today's episode, I thought doing something a little cheeky could be fun. And if you notice by the title, it's 10 things I hate about being a vintage shop owner. Now, to preface this with, I love being a vintage shop owner. Absolutely love it. I wouldn't change it for anything. But as within any industry, there are things that happen that just make you want to slap yourself silly. So a lot of this is said in jest. But if you've ever worked in any type of retail industry, you're going to understand completely what I mean. And these are things that happen on a day-to-day basis at the shop that make the experience a little bit challenging. But some things create really great conversations. So if that's something that you want to hear, the 10 reasons why I hate being a vintage shop owner, then stay tuned. Before I hop into those 10 things, I did want to share something funny that happened the other day. Now, a couple weeks ago, I had an event, an after-hours event in my shop, right before Valentine's Day. It wasn't a Valentine's Day event. It was my take on it. And it was called Get a Heart On, a night of vintage debauchery. And we had tarot, drag performer, art, music, mocktails. It was just a nice night to hang out with people and people that shared the weird interests that I do. And part of the event, I had a little mini museum display of some of the naughty vintage novelty toys that I've collected over the years. And so there are a lot of penises, vaginas. It was amazing. And they're all in this little cabinet. And usually after events, it takes me sometimes a little bit to clean up and put things away. So this little cabinet full of all of these novelty toys is sitting in my back room, right by my back door where I have my fire extinguisher. So yesterday, I had someone from a company that services my fire extinguishers come in just to do a check. And I led him back there, and I didn't realize that, oh crap, I still have that display right in front. And so the entire time he was here, he had to just awkwardly stand next to this cabinet full of plastic penises and vaginas. And I have one where it was, what do you get for the woman who has everything? And it's a maxi pad with glitter on it. It's from the 70s. It's hilarious. So he's awkwardly kind of staying clear from it like it was diseased. I was a little embarrassed, but then I was proud because I've amassed this collection that really makes people feel things. So I thought I just had to share that. It's little happenings like that that remind me why I collect the things I do. just to get some kind of reaction out of people. I feel like that's the ultimate point, right? All right, let's get into it. So with this top 10 list, now that these aren't in order of what annoys me the most or what I've hate the most, I just wrote down a list as things have happened. I always leave notes around my shop and notebooks and my planner of things that happen that make me pause and things that I want to have a conversation about later, just jotting these notes. So this top 10 list is not of importance. It's just as things have happened. And number 1 on my list goes back to my big theme of size inclusivity. And I have had this happen so many times in my shop, almost more so here than when I was in corporate retail. And probably that's just because I'm in closer proximity to a lot of my customers. But recently I've had a lot of parents coming in with their kids of various ages, and the parents are blatantly size shaming their kids. Over the weekend, I had a family come in, and every time the daughter wanted to try something on, the mom would go, "Oh, you're never going to fit that. Your waist is too big for that." Or, "No, you've got too big of a butt for that." And just making these little, just aggressive comments about their body and how nothing is going to fit them. So just don't try it on. It's not going to fit you. It just astounded me. And this parent was saying it so loudly. She wasn't even trying to hide the fact that this is what she was saying to her child. And mind you, it doesn't matter what the size of this child was. But what I can say is that this child had more awareness of their body than their parent did. And the parent was preventing them from making choices about what they wanted to wear, what they wanted to try on. And it just led me to think, how as we as a society, how have we let this become so normalized? And I have seen this happen so many times. And you can't change a parent's mind. We all know this. So to kind of counteract that, if I get a moment alone with the child individual, I say child, anybody under 18 to me is a child. Legally, they are. I'm 33. Everybody's a child to me. But I try to take a moment if I'm in the dressing room with them or I help them pick something out and I say, "No, I think that looks really good. No, I think that's going to look amazing. I really think you should try that on." Or I'll slip it into their dressing room for them. Because I remember when I was a kid, I was always curvy. I developed way faster than all my friends. So clothing didn't fit me like it did everybody else. And there was a boutique in, I believe it was in Moorhead. It's long since been closed. And I was so intimidating shopping there. I think I was 12 or 13. It was awkward. I had boobs. I didn't know what to do with anything. And I remember my mom just wanted me to have a good experience. And I was very lucky to have that support. And on top of it, I remember vividly the sales associate that helped me. I can see her. If I saw her today, I would still remember her because I went to this shop a lot. But the help that she gave me, if something didn't fit, she'll go, "No worries, I'll go grab another one. We have plenty to try on." And she would just hand me stuff and then tell me, "You look great. That looks amazing." And just positive affirmations like that will last a lifetime. It's one of the few positive things in my life that I remember so vividly. Normally, it's a lot of negative things a lot of us tend to hold on to. But I always think of that experience. And when I see that happening in the shop, I try to think of ways that I can turn it around Sometimes it's not easy. Sometimes I don't even get a chance to talk to the child. It's just the parent that's in control. But that's one of the things that just, it grinds my gears when, and it's a lot of the times it's parents. I can't recall off the top of my head if I've had people come in here with their friends who have done that. A lot of times it's mothers telling their kids that that's not going to fit you. You're too big for that. Your ass is too wide for that. Your hips are too big for that. It's sad. And some kids take it with a grain of salt, but a lot of them don't. They take it seriously. And you can see that affects their view of themselves and what they're wearing. So that's my top reason, or one of my reasons. Not my top reason, but that's one of the many, is the body shaming that I see happening. And number 2, and this is one that there's context to this, and that are the late shoppers. Now, if you've ever worked at a mall job, if you have people in when you're closing, you are not allowed to say that you're closing. You are not allowed to close with them in the shop. You have to just stay there until they're ready to leave. I have had many mall jobs in my life, and when you would see that one customer who would have an armful of stuff, and it was 5 minutes to close, and they head over to the dressing room and want to try stuff on, you know you're going to be there for another 45 minutes or an hour. So that's the kind of late shopping I'm talking about. Now, 9 times out of 10 here, I don't mind staying open late. I love being here. I love my shop. Normally, I just go home afterwards anyways. It's not that big of a deal. But the very small fraction of people that I take issue with are the ones who acknowledge that they know you're closing, but they don't care. And I do have that. And I just had this happen last week. I had a family come in. They were eating down the street. And we closed in 5 minutes. And that was a particular night where it was actually, we were celebrating my birthday that night. And we had reservations at a local restaurant. So of all nights, that was the night I really needed to get out of here on time. This family and their kids walk in and they say, oh, they close in 5 minutes. Well, but we want to look around. So they take their time walking around, picking everything up. They see that we're starting to close. I'm very anxious to get going. And they just keep taking their time and not even acknowledging the fact that we are closing. And eventually, 20 minutes later, they slowly mosey and they end up leaving and they don't even buy anything. Now, this might ruffle some feathers, but being that I've worked in the service industry my entire life, this is just how I operate. If I'm in a shop and I know they're closing really soon, if it's 15 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes too, I know exactly what I want, I go in there, get it, and I'm gone. If somehow I'm in a shop and I don't realize it's closed, I make sure to buy something to show that I don't want to waste your time. And I know that's probably an unpopular opinion. But in my head, to know that a shop is closing, a store is closing, a restaurant's closing, and you think it's more important for you just to bum around instead of letting this individual get on with their life. And this was a weekend too. So there was plenty of time for people to come in that day. It shows so much disrespect. And in that same time, when this couple was in here, more people kept coming in because they saw this family in here, so they thought we were open. So if you've worked retail, I know this doesn't take much explanation, but it's a little frustrating because I still have that mentality of I don't tell people that we're closing because I still have that engraved in my brain when I worked in corporate retail. But have any of you ever dealt with that? Whether you work in a restaurant, retail space, how do you handle it? How do you feel about it? Again, the majority of the time, people that come in late, they're great. I don't mind. It's just the small majority that almost act like you revolve around them and don't even care that you're staying open late for them. It's almost like they just expect you to. That one happens a lot. But again, there are those that come in late who are fantastic. They're wonderful. Even if they don't buy anything, they're super sweet. It's just that small percentage. All right, so the next few actually all tie in together. And number 3, I put this as like the fashionistas. And what I mean by that are the people that come in who are very trend focused. They don't buy anything that isn't on trend, whether it's the latest pair of shoes, the latest color palette or Pantone color or anything. And I get people like that come in, and it's like a shop like this must drive them crazy because we don't carry anything that's on trend. I typically just pick out things that I like and that I think other people will like, whether they be really colorful or really great silhouette. And it's interesting watching these individuals walk around the store and not understand at all what is happening here. And it's very interesting. And I always tie it back to working in corporate retail because it gives you a really interesting perspective when you work in the small business retail world. And much of corporate retail, they have all of the trends and clothing and everything set out for you. You basically buy what's on the mannequin. There's no such thing as having to assemble your own outfit. It's all perfectly crafted and curated for you. So when you come into a shop, whether it's a vintage store, a secondhand store, a thrift store, anything like that, where it's an amalgamation of different styles, different eras, different everything, and you really have to hone in on what your style is. What do you like? What do you want to wear? And put into practice creating your own look. It's really interesting. It kind of reminds me of in the first Austin Powers movie, they have what's called the fembots. And when they're just overwhelmed with his raw sexuality. I can't remember what he called it in the movie, but their heads exploded. And seeing the level of panic on some people's faces, and it doesn't matter what gender, this is all genders I've seen this happen to. They don't quite know what to think or where to start. And oftentimes they'll just quickly, look at things and then just be out, because nothing here is set up for you just to buy everything off a mannequin and leave. I want you to assemble your own outfit. I want you to be creative. That's always been my goal. But oftentimes, when you get people who are very trend focused in here, they sometimes have a little bit of that belief system that we're all behind. We're behind the times. We're not fashion forward. We're not forward thinking, which has always really amused me. And that's where I'm going into number 4. This ties it in there. Is when people kind of poke fun or just mock some of the pieces that we have. And I know this happens at a lot of different vintage shops. It's not something that happens on a daily basis, but you see it a lot. People that just don't understand it. And there's so many different reasons. You get people who grew up in these eras not understanding why we like any of this stuff. I understand that 110%. I don't know why people want those velour tracksuits. So I get it. But when you get people who come in here thinking that fashion is something that Like every trend is new. Every new season, it's new stuff, and you should be thinking ahead and moving forward and not, focusing on fashion from the past. I find it really entertaining because history has always dictated our style, our fashion, our clothing, and you still see it today. Any trend that comes up, these aren't new trends. You've seen these cycle time and time again. I often use the example of shoulder pads. This past summer, I had a lot of people seeing on TikTok their favorite creators finding a lot of pieces from the 80s with shoulder pads because they wanted that really angular triangle look. And so that became a really hot trend for a while. I saw it 10 years ago when I first started selling online. This all comes back again. We're constantly in a hamster wheel of style and fashion. I was recently organizing my lingerie collection. And I have pieces going back to the 1920s up to modern pieces. And I was looking at a piece from the 40s that had this front wire that went. Sorry, I had to stop recording quickly because I had a delivery. That's what happens when I record during shop hours, but that's okay. But it had this front wire that went down it was about 3 inches down from the cups. And it was almost like an incomplete rectangle. And that was for a lot of, lower cut dresses. It had this half circle wire in back dipping low for low back dresses. And I thought that it's really interesting. I've never seen one like that before. And then I was scrolling through Depop. I have a Depop shop, but I put random things up there. But I was scrolling through Depop and I found a bra, I think it was from Asian Provocateur, that had the exact same wire and build going down the front. And I had never seen that in modern lingerie before. So it brings that back to, we constantly recycle methods and styles from the past. You see it. I can point it out. Anybody that walks in the store, I can point out at least one thing that you're wearing that has been in fashion at one point in time. Or I can tell you the significance of why something is like that. Why do we have an underwire? Why do pieces of underwear or panties have this certain kind of elastic? It's history, and we keep building on it. So when people are very trend focused and only want to stick to the trends, I always look at it as you're better off just finding things that you like, and you're going to hit a trend eventually. I mean, even if you go back to cosmetics and hair, when I was in the 7th grade, I had really chunky highlights. I had darker auburn hair at the time, and they bleached streaks in my hair. And I had what is now in fashion called money pieces in the front. But back then it was just obscenely massive, chunky blonde highlights. But everything comes back again. Everything becomes a style again. So you really might as well just wear what you want and not worry about following a trend or being fashionable. The best way to be stylish is just to dress how you want. That's why I find it really interesting when I get people who come in who are very, very focused on buying the latest and greatest and can't see past that into pieces that are really beautiful and would look amazing on them and could create a really amazing outfit and maybe start a trend themselves. Wearing vintage wasn't always the coolest thing. Going to thrift shops wasn't always the coolest thing. But everything comes back again. I mean, when I was growing up, buying things at thrift stores, I had people that told me that's what poor people do. And yeah, didn't grow up with a lot of money, But I also liked finding vintage in thrift stores. And I still have pieces that I found when I was in junior high, vintage pieces in a thrift store. And now it's a really cool on trend thing where it's really hard to find pieces like that now. So really just do what you want. Wear what you want, have fun, create your own style. And that's what I really, really hope I can drive home to people when they come in here. And not everybody gets it. And style is so fluid. But I get it. It's like the lyric in Phantom of the Opera, slave to fashion. Sometimes you're a slave to trends. And that's kind of what we were always told growing up. It's always the keeping up with the Joneses mentality. So this next one was at number 5. It ties in a little bit more of a pop culture reference. I've been watching a lot of documentaries lately about style and fashion, and there are always 3 that I go back to. That is the amazing documentary on Iris Apfel. If you haven't seen it, oh my gosh, if you talk about style, this is a woman that buys what she likes and does not give a damn what anybody says. She sets her own style. And when they describe her or when they do drawings or graphics of her, she has these very over-accentuated, exaggerated mod glasses, and that's become her signature. And I always find it amazing when people have a signature style where you just take one piece that they wear and you know it's them. So watch that. But I've also watched on repeat, it's embarrassing how many times I've watched these. I believe it's the first Monday in May and the September issue, which are both documentaries following US Vogue magazine. First Monday in May is a documentary following the creation of the Met Gala. And I believe that documentary followed China Through the Looking Glass. And the other one, the September issue, is when they released their biggest issue of the year with all of the latest fashion, up-and-coming designers. It's this huge, huge thing. And my upteenth time watching the September issue, a conversation with editor Anna Wintour popped out at me, and it never really had before, but it's something that I've been thinking about a lot more recently. She talks about her family and growing up and how her siblings have these really high-profile jobs, whether they're in nonprofits or medical. I mean, I can't remember, so don't quote me, but very conventionally successful jobs. And she talks about how her family just doesn't understand what she does. And they don't take it seriously because they don't see fashion as being serious. And how it's looked at as being a very vain and self-absorbed industry, which, yeah, it is. But it's so much more than that. And hearing her talk about it, for whatever you think of Anna Wintour and, you know, how she's been portrayed in pop culture, whether it be The Devil Wears Prada, she does have a point. And that's where a quote in The Devil Wears Prada sticks out when Andy, when she first started, came in when they were styling a shoot. And they were trying to decide what belt to put with a certain garment. And she goes, it's just a belt. It's just blue. Like, aren't they all blue? And Miranda, who is a play off of Anna Wintour, has this really great monologue of the significance of fashion, how it's not just clothing, that it filters down what they pick in their offices, funnels down to even the sweater she was wearing. And how you say you don't follow trends and it's so below you, but yet you're wearing a sweater that we handpicked for you. And it was really interesting. And that's another thing that I've noticed a lot being in this industry is the fashion industry is one thing, but then when you go into the niche areas of vintage, a lot of people don't understand what the importance is of old stuff, right? I get a lot of people saying used clothing. And I find that so really grates my nerves when people call vintage pieces used clothing. I feel like a lot of people say that in a very derogatory way. And I know to a lot of people that sounds like, come on, you guys, they're clothes. It's not that big of a deal, but it is. And one of the coolest examples recently of how important fashion is actually goes back to a discovery in 2019 of an altar cloth that was in rural England, I believe. And they believe that it was one of the only surviving garments that Queen Elizabeth I had worn. No one has ever found any of the garments that she's had. They've long since been destroyed. And they believe it was from the dress she wore in her rainbow portrait, which I believe is currently in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And it wasn't just being used as an altar cloth in this country church, but it had beautiful silver embroidery. And it was interesting because as they studied it, they said that it looks like it would have taken around 600 hours to originally embroider this piece. They found that the material was an Italian cloth of silver, woven with silver bullion. The dyes that they discovered also contained really, really expensive indigo and red dye that they believe was sourced from Mexico. And it shows, as a part of history, just the arts and the craftsmanship of these garments, and that we get a piece of probably one of the greatest monarchs that Europe has ever seen. And it survived, and they can restore it. And for years, they were restoring this. The Victoria and Albert Museum in the UK has these really cool videos up on YouTube that show you how they do textile preservation. Sorry, my phone is going off like crazy. And it shows the painstaking work that they have to do. They have to come up with these dyes and use all of this chemistry to come up with the right color dye. And they go through tons of swatches. They have to have such a light and fine hand when they're repairing pieces. It's amazing. I couldn't even begin to comprehend how much work that takes. But to get that close to something that this huge figure in our history wore, I mean, come on. That's huge. Anything like this garment made today, I mean, it would almost be priceless. But it just shows fashion is serious, and fashion is so much more than the latest color or the latest graphic. It's history. It's how these pieces were created. It's folk art. The master craftsmen who made this garment, I mean, come on. They're artists. It's folk art. And thankfully it's on display. I believe it's still on display. But if you look up historical pieces of garments that have been found, it's amazing that pieces that we thought were only created within the past couple of centuries have predated everything beyond our wildest imagination. I would have to go back. I feel like I might have talked about this in a YouTube video I did on some of the lingerie history of pieces in my collection. But it was one of the earliest bras that they found. And I believe, oh gosh, I swear they said it was at least 2,000 years old. Again, don't quote me. I'm just thinking of this off the top of my head. But people were wearing bras that long ago. I mean, it's fascinating. It's really fascinating. And that's why when you have historians talking about textiles, clothing, you really need to take it seriously because, again, That's something we wear every day. More than the latest cosmetics, more than the latest hairstyles. These are things that will never fade. It's amazing. And definitely, I highly recommend looking more into fashion history and just all of the cool discoveries that they've come up with since. So I'm kind of jumping around a bit. And I was deciding which one I should talk about next. So I think I'll go with this one. And this is actually going to be the topic of, I believe this is going to be the topic of next week's episode. And that is the difference between vintage versus secondhand and thrift. Now, I found this really interesting article and I bookmarked it. And again, I'll go into depth about it in next week's episode about the difference between vintage shops and thrift and secondhand stores. And it is a very, very common, one of the most common questions I get. And one that I really enjoy talking about. Because there is, to me, a very huge difference. And I get that a lot. I get people coming in, and if they're not a vintage shopper, they don't typically go into vintage stores or antique stores. I mean, what else would you think shops like these are? Consignment shops, something like that. And I get a lot of people asking, oh, so are you a thrift store? Do you take donations? And I say, no, I'm a vintage shop. And the confusion on their faces, they don't understand what that means. And I've had people say, well, aren't those the same thing? And they're not. And I'll tell you why. Now, with thrift stores or secondhand stores, consignment shops, depending, they can carry a multitude of things. They have pre-loved modern clothing. Lately, I've heard that there's been a surge in thrift stores taking overstock, clothing overstock, kind of. If you're in the Midwest and you've ever heard of rake stock, it's a very similar thing. They'll buy clothing or get clothing donated in bulk from, let's say, Target that didn't sell. And instead of trashing it or writing it off as a loss, corporations will donate it and just write that off. It makes sense, right? And then sometimes in thrift and secondhand stores, you can find vintage. So it's a mash of everything, and that's why people love it. It's the hunt. It's the dig. If you're looking for vintage, you dig through all these racks, and that makes it even more enjoyable when you find an amazing vintage piece. But with vintage shops, we stick to a very strict guideline. And I haven't met a lot of vintage shops that deviate from this. And so vintage, as it stands now, I see it as anything being over 25 years old, but under 100. Anything over 100 years old is considered antique, clothing, decor, furniture, otherwise. So right now, let's say something 2002. For me, that doesn't quite constitute as vintage. Some sellers go by the 20-year mark, and there's no definitive answer. I just stick to 25 because it's a little bit easier. So I stick to pieces around 1998 and earlier. However, I do not sell pre-loved new clothing. Now, saying that, I do sell new clothing. I sell vintage-inspired garments from small businesses, but they are not pre-owned and they are not pre-worn. And that's the difference. I mean, really, it doesn't go beyond that. Vintage shops don't carry pre-loved, modern, new clothing, but thrift and secondhand stores can carry vintage. They're pretty much a catch-all. Another slight difference, And this is another question I get too. Are people asking if I get pieces donated? And of course, if you think I'm along the same lines of a thrift store, that would be your first thought. But typically vintage shops, we buy our pieces. It's very rare when you get things given or donated to you. It happens, but it's not an everyday occurrence. We typically buy and source our pieces ourselves. But the one thing that put this on my list, and it's usually always a certain kind of person that says stuff like this. It's people that would never normally shop here. They're just more curious and come in. And I could count on the number of times this has happened. But I've had people stand and argue with me about, well, no, this is a thrift store. Like, they're like, vintage shops and thrift stores are the same thing. And of course, no matter what I say, I can't change their mind, but they're really not. And I'm happy to have that conversation with people. But when I have people coming in who look at a rack of clothing from an estate that I helped to organize, and I got to know the family, I learned the history of it. I mended them, I washed them, I wrote down the provenance so that I could pass these stories on to my customers, and to have someone, and 9 times out of 10, if not 10 times out of 10, they use the term thrift in a very derogatory sounding word, like it's dirty. And oh gosh, that grates my nerves. But they talk about these pieces like they're trash. And having to sit here and defend why these pieces are important and why they're not just pieces you should discard does get exhausting. And you have people that are polite about it, and you have people that aren't and think that, oh, this 1950s dress that belonged to this socialite in Los Angeles, well, I wouldn't give you more than $10 for it because I could find this at a thrift store. You can find many great pieces at thrift stores. And if you're lucky enough to find really cool pieces like that, more power to you. But a lot of times you don't meet the people behind them. You don't get the stories. That gets kind of lost. And that's what I try to push and impress upon people, that it's so much more than just plopping a garment on a rack. It's learning about it, learning why this particular garment is amazing, where it came from, the story behind it. So it's hard. And a lot of shops, whether they're thrift shops, secondhand, consignment, vintage stores, we all get these same conversations. And the best we can do is just keep trying to educate people and then just keep doing our thing. When people get argumentative is when it gets a little bit hard and tedious. All right, so number 9 might ruffle some feathers, but bear with me, hear me out. I've got a different perspective on this. And that is when people come in and play dress up. So if you were like me as a kid, a lot of us kids who grew up at the mall didn't have social media, cell phones. That was where we got our kicks. And I remember being a kid, and all of my friends would want to go to the prom section and try on prom dresses. And we would have our little Kodak cameras and take pictures. I usually never tried them on because I'm not a gown. I've never been a gown person. But I remember watching all my friends do it. And you'd have these really expensive dresses, but no one would ever be monitoring them. There'd be no one around. So you got to have pretty much free reign over the entire section. And I remember time after time of my friends trying pieces on, they would get ripped, or beading would come off, or a zipper would get stuck, and then they'd just put it back up on the rack and run away. And being a curvier gal growing up, a lot of those pieces went to fit me, so I didn't ever really try much on. So it kind of saved me from that. But when you have people coming in and doing the same thing in a vintage store, it goes to a whole other level. And it's because a lot of these pieces are one of a kind and you don't find anymore. So once they're damaged, unless it's just like a minor popped seam, there's not really much you can do about it, and you sometimes can't salvage it. And it's interesting because when people come in, you see a lot of these clothes that some people see as costumes and odd or interesting, and they just want to try it on just to see what it would look like. And there's nothing inherently wrong about that. I mean, not everybody who tries stuff on is intending to buy it. And that's just a fact. But I've noticed that the majority of clothes that people end up leaning more towards wanting to play dress up in are a lot of the pieces that are more fragile or have a lot of extensive beading, and there's way more room for error. And so that one's kind of a hard one to navigate, because I remember when I worked at a boutique downtown, I had been working there for years. And of course, in retail, and I'm a broken record with this, you tend to get jaded the longer you work in it. And you kind of get that attitude of, I really don't give a fuck. And I would have, and this boutique carried new clothing. So it wasn't vintage or anything like that. But I would get like tons of girls in, mainly high school, junior high, bringing in or trying to bring in like 15 items of clothing for each girl and just wanting to play dress up, take pictures. And after a while, I found myself getting really, really frustrated because a lot of them, and I have this still happen to this day, after they're done trying stuff on, they literally dump it in a heap on the floor and just leave and walk out. And that's it. So it's not hard to understand why that tweaks a nerve for me. And I remember at this boutique, I think I'd been working there for 6 years at the time. And I was a manager, and I thankfully had a boss that was just as quick with words as I was. So I got a little bit more leeway with what I said. But there was this group of girls who were just trying stuff on, and I could see under, like, the dressing room had, the cutout at the bottom, so you could see feet or whatever. And this girl had clothing just all over the floor, heaped in a pile, and she was stepping on them. She had her shoes on, and I didn't lose it, but I went into I don't care mode. And I marched up to them and I told them that they needed to leave. And I asked them, is this how you treat your clothes at home? Is this how your home looks? And the look of shock on their faces, like they were so confused why I was upset by this. And I get adults that do that. Like, I have adults that come in and do the exact same thing. They will try vintage pieces on. And I limit how many things people can bring into the dressing rooms for this as being one of the reasons. And I go in the dressing room afterwards and everything is just piled on the floor. And it's interesting to me. You shouldn't do it anywhere you go. It's just a common courtesy of not disrespecting the people that have to come in and clean up after you. I mean, not everybody goes to the extreme of, like, when I go to places and try stuff on, I try my best to, I hang everything back up and button everything back up. I try my best to not make it more work for the person after me. But I know if I had ever done that in a dressing room in my life of dumping things on or just playing dress up and ripping things, my mom would have never let me go out shopping again. And so it's interesting. And when it comes to vintage clothing, I never quite understand when people see this beautiful garment and try it on and just chuck it on the ground like it's nothing. And it's amusing because when you confront them on it, sometimes they don't even realize they do it, which is a whole other discussion. But that's where, it's hard because you want people when they come in to have fun. And again, if someone tries on 6 things, the odds are they're not going to buy all 6 things. That's life. That's retail. Maybe they'll buy 1 thing. Maybe they'll buy 2. Maybe they won't buy anything. And that's normal too. But there are those that come in and will state, oh, well, I'm just going to try this on. I'm not going to buy it. I just want to try it on and take pictures in it. And I've had people tell me that. I have a line in the shop that is one of the more, I don't know, high-end line. I don't like that term, but it's a little bit more expensive because it's a small batch line. They use really good fabrics. It's more of a luxe line. And once I got that line in, I did have a good amount of people wanting to just come in and just try it on, just to see what it would look like. And that's fine. But then I would get people that would come up to me, and I kid you not, you see it all, you hear it all. I've had people who've come right up to me and said, I want to try that $130 robe-on, but I'm just letting you know I'm not going to buy it. Like, I would never spend that much money on something. I just want to take some selfies with it so I can put it up on my social media. And I'll ask, oh, great. Are you going to tag us in it? Are you going to tag our shop in it? Well, no, I just want to show it to my friends. So now just multiply that times like 10, and you experience that all the time. So it's understandable why you get a little frustrated. But that's one of the things that when I've been working in retail has always been a huge source of frustration for me. Because I've had jobs where, when I worked at the mall, I worked for, oh gosh, what was it called? New York and Company, when I was in high school. And I would always get dressing room duty. I like hanging things up. I like putting things away. But the amount of people that you would get in who just did not care. I had a lady grab the pile of clothing she left on the floor and throw it at me without me saying anything. I didn't say anything. She just threw it at me and left. So I think being in this industry for so long, you have more of a hair trigger on what affects you, but just keep that in mind when you go to a clothing store, just a clothing store in general, that it's okay if you just want to try some stuff on, get a feel for it, but just have respect. Have respect. Hanging something up here and there takes you 2 seconds, and it just shows that you're respecting the person who's going to be on the other end of it. This one turned into more of a rant, but it is what it is. So number 10 is one that I know I've talked to other vintage sellers and vintage shops about this one, and everybody has a different opinion on it. I, again, can only speak for myself and what I've experienced, but the number 10 reason why I hate being a vintage shop owner are the resellers. So resellers are people that, I'm technically a reseller in terms of I buy new pieces from vendors and I sell them, but they also sell their pieces. So technically I could fall into a reseller. But what I mean in this instance are people that come into the shop, and whether they have their own vintage shop or they have a consignment shop, whatever it is, and they come in specifically to buy pieces for them to resell. Now, this is standard practice. There's nothing unusual about that. However, where it gets annoying and frustrating are when the resellers come in and try to haggle you down on all your prices so they have a bigger profit margin. And I know I've had vendors or sellers coming in from California, Los Angeles specifically, who will come in and buy pieces, but they never haggle, because out there, a dress that I charge like full retail $26 for, that's their wholesale price. That's what they pay for stuff typically on the West Coast or even the East Coast. So for them, that's great. Perfect. And they're good to go. But there is an instance, and I don't know if you could find these people online, so I'm trying not to give any specific information. But there is a couple that when I first opened were referred to me by another shop who works with them, and they acquire pieces, mainly vintage, to sell to productions, whether it be TV shows, movies, like really cool, like really, really cool. And they would come in and they always wanted to haggle and get you down on a price. Which if I had something they were looking at that I've had for a long time, sure, why not? If I've had this dress for a year and no one's touched it, yeah, I'll give you a deal, it's fine. But every time they would come into my shop, they would always go straight for the pieces that I literally would just put out on the floor. Just put out on the floor. And I remember I had gotten in all of these really cool 1940s and 1950s complete men's suits. I'm talking vest, pants, suspenders, blazer, impeccable condition. I had the provenance behind them. Oh, they're beautiful. And they came in, and I had literally just put them out on the floor. And they came in and wanted to buy one of them. And I think at that time I was charging for the suit. I know one of them was a 4-piece set from the 50s, early 50s. And I think I had it priced at $75. It wasn't over $75. It wasn't under $55. So it was in between that. And for those pieces, I paid for those. I had someone come in, private buying appointment. I paid them a fair price for it. I paid them wholesale price for it. And when this couple came in, they offered me like $10 or $15 for the set. So it went from being like a $75 set to they said, well, we'll give you $15. And I told them, no, I can't do that. And I kid you not, they told me, well, but we need to make money on this. And I remember one of my interactions with them, I got kind of pissy and I said, what do you think I am? I'm a business. I need to make money too. And we kind of hit an impasse there. But they would always come in and try to haggle down the price. But it wouldn't just be, oh, would you go down $10, buy this, or $5? It would be like a significant markdown. I mean, think 75 down to $15 or $10. Now, all the other owners that they worked with would do that. And that's their prerogative. Because if you want to get things moving fast, and if you pay like bottom dollar for it, then you aren't losing as much. But when it came to pieces that were really like impeccable pieces that I paid for, I paid a fair price, and they lowball me like that, and multiple times, it would get really frustrating. And oh my goodness, they would come in all the time and do it. And eventually I had to tell them, I'm not going to give you any deals. I said, if like the majority of things on my floor at the time I had just brought out, and I said, if you're looking at getting deals, that's not what I do. And I said, if you buy like 20 plus pieces, okay, we'll talk. But when you're just buying 1 or 2 pieces here or there, no, I'm not cutting my prices so you can make money and I make nothing. So eventually that couple stopped coming in because they also didn't want they didn't want to pay taxes on the clothing they bought from here because they were from a state that doesn't charge on clothing. And I had a conversation with them where I said, I need you to show me your reseller's tax permit so that when I turn in my stuff to my accountants, they know I just didn't randomly not charge tax and I don't become liable for that. And they did business a really different way. They were very combative about giving that paperwork to me to prove that they didn't have to pay sales tax. And it was a whole thing. So I haven't seen them since then, which I'm not sad about because I'm not a resale shop. And again, if someone sees me underpricing something on my floor and they know they can make more money off of it, please, that is the nature of the business. It's impossible for me to know everything about everything. And I do have like a section of markdown vintage that if you're a reseller and you want some $5, $10 sale vintage, have at it, please. And luckily this doesn't happen often, but when it does, it's usually the same type of people who are bulk vendors who just want to get the most bottom dollar, lowest price that they can literally at your expense. And I know some vintage sellers who, when they work with people like this, they'll wash and mend all the clothes and end up selling it to these people for the exact same amount that they paid. To me, it doesn't make any sense, but it shows them that they can keep doing it. And so they come into shops like mine and get upset when I'm not willing to compromise my product and my business to help them make a buck. So that hasn't happened as much recently. Like I said, if it does, it's usually people that come from either one of the coasts who are resellers, but they don't necessarily come in to buy stuff to resell. But if they see a good deal, they'll take it, as they should. I've done it. When I was in Denver, it's rare in Denver because, again, location. Vintage prices in all of the bigger cities obviously are way more expensive than they are in places like Fargo. But I remember being in a vintage shop in downtown Denver, and they had, oh my gosh, just racks and racks of amazing vintage. But I found a really cool Vanity Fair nightgown that they shockingly underpriced. And there was nothing wrong with it, no holes, no stains. It was priced as if it were damaged, but it wasn't. But that was the only thing I found in their shop that was below like $50. And so I purchased it and I brought it back home. I did some research on it. I laundered it and I resold it. I resold it for a price that I felt was appropriate, and it sold right away, and that was that. So it's not uncommon. But I mean, I would never go to another shop and haggle on prices just so I could get a better deal. But there you have it. My 10th reason. And now I have to say again, I love my job. I love being a shop owner. I love having a vintage shop. It's been my dream for as far back as I can remember. However, that doesn't mean that it's perfect. There are things that upset me. There are things that annoy me, that I scratch my head about, that I go home just wondering, what planet did people come from? That's normal. I haven't met anybody who has had a job, whether they work for themselves, work for a corporation, that doesn't have something about their job that irks them. It's life. It's business. But that doesn't negate the fact that I love what I do. And I've done so many different things and jobs in my life. I've been in salon management. I did freight. I was a dishwasher. I've been a server. I've actually been a dishwasher twice. I've done a lot of different jobs. And every single one of them had things that sucked. Even jobs that I really loved. But that's kind of the beautiful part of it, because it teaches you things when you go into other establishments that, oh yeah, I don't like when this person did this to me or treated me like this. So I'm not going to do that when I go into this place. I'm going to be even more mindful of how I'm treating someone. So it's constantly learning. But again, this is more of sarcasm. I love being a vintage shop owner, but some of these reasons make it hard for anybody. So if you can take anything away from it, it's just that. If you do any of these things on the list, I'm not shaming you. I'm just telling you how it looks from my perspective as someone who's been on both sides. So take from that what you will. To end today's episode, I thought I would just give you a little glimpse at what next week's episode is going to be on. And I'm going to actually give you the article that inspired this ahead of time in case you wanted to read it before I talk about it. Otherwise, I will be posting it in the bio on next week's episode. But it's an article I found on BuzzFeed News. And again, this is not sponsored, but the guys that created Instagram after they sold it created this new app called Artifact. And it's like Instagram or Facebook, but for news articles. And the more you engage and read articles, it tailors your feed to what articles they think you want to read. So it's been a really great resource for me, not necessarily news-wise, because I tend to go more towards fashion and art and culture on this app, but it was an app that popped up from, or an app, oh my goodness, you guys, I'm tongue-tied. It's an article that popped up that was suggested to me on Artifact from BuzzFeed. And it's called "People Are Calling a Depop Seller a Bad Person After She Posted a Haul of the Thrift Store Finds She Planned to Sell." And this was a little bit of drama on TikTok. And for those of you who don't have TikTok, don't start now. But if you do, you may have come across this, especially if you are a vintage seller, vintage lover, if you love thrifting, if you love secondhand, sustainable clothing, you may have seen this pop up. And reading through the article and what people had to say, there were really interesting opinions on both sides of this argument. And both sides had valid reasons, but I thought it'd be really interesting to do an episode on that. And again, this podcast is all about conversations I have with people in my shop. And this goes back to questions I've had people ask me on how do I feel about people going to thrift stores and purchasing things to resell them. And people asking if I ever do that. So if that's something that interests you, that's what I'm going to be talking about next week. But again, this is an article on BuzzFeed News. It's under their internet culture section. So if you want to read it ahead of time, please do. But if not, I'm going to break it down next week. And I would really love to know your thoughts and any specific questions you have. Now, if you're listening to this and want to throw your 2 cents in or a question in, head on over to our Instagram at Conversations in a Vintage Shop. Leave a comment, send us a message, and I'd be happy to answer it. Because I think this can be a very divisive topic. And I've seen people who are on both ends of the spectrum on how they feel about it, and people in between who really just don't care. So if that's something that interests you, stay tuned for next week. But until then, thank you for joining me on today's episode. This became a really long episode. I apologize. But if you stuck through this long, congrats. You're the best. And we'll see you next week.